Russia has waged war on Ukraine for over 40 months, and today we'll examine the military situation. I'm Julian Repke, and this is Build Situation Room. And we start in the western part of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. The Russian advance continues there, but so do the Ukrainian defense efforts. And we see both combined in a video from the small village of Seleny High. Seleny High, a place where the Russians had not yet gained a foothold, but where we now see, based on this new footage, that the situation has shifted. That Russian incursions have also occurred here, and they typically hide in the cellars again. The Ukrainians are attempting, as we observe, with kamikaze drones to bury or engage in combat against the Russians in this specific scenario. And now we're seeing this with very different calibers. On one hand, classic kamikaze drones that fly into these houses, as we can see here. On the other hand, we can also clearly see relatively heavy bombs being dropped by larger drones, specifically referred to as bomber drones, which are particularly active and heavily involved in that specific area. And now around Seleny High, the Russians are literally trying to burn them out of the buildings they have seized and are currently maintaining control of. This also demonstrates that Seleny High is now at least partially under Russian control. Troops occupied it, and this is one of the very last villages that still remains under Ukrainian control in this particular part of the Donetsk region. We can let it run a bit longer, see that really heavy bombs are being dropped here by the Ukrainian units currently active in this specific area of the region, who are attacking these various houses. And nonetheless, it's once again something you have to acknowledge, that even from this town, or at least from this particular part of it, the Ukrainians have withdrawn and the Russians have managed to gain a foothold here. We reported yesterday that 2 villages were recaptured. That remains the current status, but it is a relatively long front with many different directions and complexities. Where the Russians are advancing, that they are often able to establish a foothold here now. We can see it, the footage just from Seleny High. We showed yesterday that in both Voskresenka, the Ukrainers managed to return, and in Yalta, the Ukrainian flag was successfully raised once more, marking progress. However, we also see that the Russians are steadily continuing to advance in Tolstoy, down there near Shevchenko, and also in the direction of Dakhne. And that's precisely why it's extremely challenging for the Ukrainians. If they manage to retake a village in one place, the front in this sector alone is still many, many kilometers long, where the Russians can continue to advance in parallel. From another place in Ukraine, there's more visual confirmation that the Ukrainian army has returned here, specifically from Kindrativka in the Sumy region in the northeast of the country. We have new Russian footage that shows us quite clearly that the whole area is fought over. The village is under the control of the Ukrainian army. First, we see a fixed-wing drone here. Here we see it attacking a road situated to the east of Kindrativka, and we can clearly observe, based on the precise geolocation we've conducted, that this specific area of the village is now firmly under Ukrainian military control. But as we've emphasized in recent days, the main issue for the Ukrainians is their lack of air superiority here. This means they are relatively defenseless, especially against the FAB-500 bombs, which we're seeing here coming in from the top left. I hope you can see that. First, second, that was just now. The third bomb is about to come in here on the right side. There we see it. It's a huge problem for the Ukrainians. While they can make advances and at times succeed in pushing the Russians out of certain villages or areas, the issue remains. They are, however, relatively defenseless against the Russian bombing because the Russians attack from the other side of the border, specifically from the Kursk region, and keep bombarding this entire area here relentlessly. Nonetheless, we clearly see that Kindrativka remains under Ukrainian control. We're also taking a look at that on the map, and we know that Kindrativka was already acknowledged by the Ukrainian army a month ago in May, so essentially 2 months back in time, as reported, was taken by the Russians a month ago in June, and now we likely have the situation where this small recapture in Andrivka was connected to the recapture in Kindrativka, and this entire area is currently under Ukrainian control, as the latest reports suggest. We always have to clearly state this at the moment because we don't know how the situation will change now, how the situation will be affected by the heavy airstrikes. And we have seen it repeatedly in the past that the Russians, after these massive bombing attacks on these villages, then moved in with their own infantry again. And in that sense, it's entirely possible that the control of this village could shift once more at any given moment. Next, we'll take a look at footage from Pokrovsk, where a Ukrainian volunteer with the 110th described the situation as difficult, as the situation has transitioned from critical to catastrophic in the past few days. Why? He stated it quite clearly. There's no secure logistics anymore. There are no connecting routes left. Almost every vehicle is targeted on the route to Pokrovsk and its neighboring twin city, Mirnohrad. And now we want to take a look at one of the videos which relatively clearly shows how these Russian attacks are carried out. Here we see a street, and we have shown it again in the past few days, a street that's heavily covered with debris. We see this from a distance, kilometers, that the Ukrainians tried to heavily cover here, and that's around Rodinske, north of Pokrovsk, another city that's absolutely vital for Ukraine to maintain its control over the entire region effectively. and we're now seeing that the Russians are trying and actually succeeding in flying in with their drones, and specifically multiple drones are active here, taking part in this ongoing attack. We're seeing this on the left side here. A Russian drone is already waiting, practically ready for an ambush or stationed in position, poised to strike at any moment. The other drone flies past it. I hope you can see that now on the right side here. Here we see it, and it now flies towards the Ukrainian vehicle. And if it doesn't work, if it doesn't explode or anything like that, the already waiting drone down here would then explode, or rather take off and attack the Ukrainian vehicle accordingly. So we see it. The Russians have several operators in action, meaning they have multiple opportunities. They have used these drones in action, and all of them are fiber optic guided drones. So we can see that relatively well. So they manage, even though we have the net here moving all around this Ukrainian vehicle, to navigate through this specific narrow corridor and then successfully execute the attack here. The Ukrainians are actively countering this, and we're about to see a video that demonstrates their approach specifically by targeting these drones already positioned on the ground, which often wait for hours to be redeployed and directly attacking them as soon as a Ukrainian vehicle passes by. We now see footage of a Ukrainian drone essentially flying toward a Russian drone on the ground, which gets completely destroyed in the process. Once more from a different angle, we can also see the Russian drone structure quite clearly here. We can stop it at this point. Typically, of course, the explosive charge is mounted here at the bottom with the detonator attached above it. Here is the battery, and right at the top here you can see it, that's the coil itself. Inside there is the fiberglass coil, and it has virtually already covered several kilometers and still has the capability to ascend further now and strike a few hundred meters ahead. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians are attacking here now and successfully managed to target this fiberglass drone, completely disabling it to ensure it can no longer strike or disrupt any Ukrainian logistics operations. We are still looking at the whole thing on the map to understand how vulnerable, how susceptible Ukrainian supply routes have become. Because we know, first up here, these are the 5 kilometers, and we know that the Russian drones have at least a 10-kilometer range. That means we can, probably it's more like 15 kilometers, so we can pretty much consider this entire area, basically what we see here, all of it under Russian fiber optic Kamikaze drones, and the road, the one we just saw was this road here, which runs through Rodinski and then continues on to Pokrovsk. That was the road where the Ukrainians tried to gain control, but where the Russians consistently managed to keep their position. To fly through these nets, using holes in them or even creating their own with their own drones and then waiting there for the Ukrainian defense. We can see it's quite a significant distance, nearly 20 kilometers from the map's start over Rodinsk, the first 10, and then another 10 kilometers into Pokrovsk. And it's once again extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to keep the logistics running here, especially when you have the situation that the entire supply route, the entire final stretch of roughly 20 kilometers is completely under Russian military control. Drone control to be precise. But the Russians also deploy drones on the ground, as we will see. We saw that from the Russian military side, an entire industry is currently working on securing logistics, which is heavily threatened because, of course, Ukraine also has a lot of drones, that they are replacing them with ground drones. And we see here one of these ground drones that was deployed into action, a very heavy drone designed to transport ammunition, which was stopped here either by the Ukrainians or alternatively halted due to a technical malfunction or failure. We now definitely see that this really powerful ground drone, which can actually move several kilometers, is being attacked here by a Ukrainian Kamikaze drone. And maybe we managed to pause the explosion right at the perfect moment, so to speak, and capture it in full detail. Let's see if we can do it, if it's possible. As said, that's where we see it. So this is exactly the Russian drone that's here, a very, very large, powerful drone loaded with different munitions. Now we clearly see the Ukrainian drone strike and the resulting explosion. Both sides are now heavily aiming for this. We know the Russians here already are further ahead because they produce it both industrially and militarily. Nevertheless, Ukrainian drone experts also gave an interview today and said, referring to Mr. Madyar, that the medium-term goal is, of course, to achieve significant advancements in this field. Not only to supply from the air, but also to replace Ukrainian infantry soldiers with drones, with robots that can shoot, that can throw grenades, that can transport ammunition, and so on. We are still at the early stages of this situation, but in this case, a Ukrainian drone actually managed to destroy a Russian robot. But at that moment, no Russian soldier was hit, and that, from a human perspective at least, is a small but notable advantage for the Russian army in this particular situation. But the whole thing, as I said, is still very much in its early stages, and there are also not enough robots yet to realistically claim that they can replace the deployed infantry. Next, we want to take a closer look at the propaganda footage broadcasted by the Russian army's Zvezda TV channel. This footage provides us with our first detailed and close-up look at the production of the Goran 2 or Shahed 136 drones by the Russian army. This footage from Yelabuga clearly demonstrates how incredibly massive the production has grown and how extensively it has ramped up. What I find truly insidious is that a considerable number of very young individuals are being utilized here. The commentators and the general director of the factory even said it involves boys and girls. They are just referred to that way, very casually. And here it says, among other things, these are propaganda posters where you can see young people and behind them, as they say, major Soviet historical figures, and among them, Joseph Stalin is prominently featured. And there it actually says in the back, Stalin lives in your DNA. That means the mass murderer, we remember, who personally carried out over 700,000 executions of Soviet citizens, for example, is now being portrayed here as a hero of the youth and also a hero of modern Russia. But we also see, and this is crucial, that we have an extremely high number of young people working here. They also take great pride in the fact that a school was essentially constructed here by the very people who initiated this factory. And in this school, they have a lot of technical subjects. After the 9th grade, the students would then start directly, were addressed, were brought into the factory, and then would start working here directly. And the really crazy part is, even in these interviews, as we see here, just a partial glimpse, they tried to push the whole thing in a very ideological way. They claimed we're not fighting Ukraine, but the Director General stated we're combating the so-called woke virus, which Joe Biden unleashed into the world to cause that fewer children would be born in the world. So the whole thing was extremely ideologically charged, really extreme propaganda and brainwashing that they were conducting with the young people here, which in the end ensured that Ukrainian teenagers and children, along with all other people, were constantly terrorized every single night without fail. Just last night, there were 426 Shahed drones or Geran-2 drones that flew into Ukraine. And all of this clearly demonstrates the industrial military scale this has taken on in Russia and how they are attempting to portray the situation here. Also interesting, they claim that all of this is domestic production and that everything comes from their own nation, even the machinery and the materials as well. Of course, the whole thing is pure propaganda. We know that the Shahed drones shot down over Kiev in July already had parts made in China from June of that year. That means less than 4 weeks after production in China, they were already assembled by Russia and then deployed in Kiev. And we also know, based on these devices, I'm trying to show again these various devices we saw earlier, these are devices, among others, from Vietnam, among others from China, but also from Japan. These are the devices that are used here to assemble the machine parts. In the end, we also got to see something quite interesting, how the drones are launched, at least here on the test site. Here we can see this kind of off-road vehicle with these frames on top, and over here, garages where they are stored. And supposedly they are launched into the air. It's just a 2-stroke engine, so you really need either a catapult or some kind of runway to get the whole thing moving forward. Then accelerates, and accordingly the drone is brought up to the necessary speed before it finally lifts off into the air. Nonetheless, we observe once again that Russia is industrially dedicated to the production of these very drones. It's estimated that, well, currently it's 500 per night. Some say soon it could be 1,000 per night. I think the German General Christian Freuding even went a step further and said Russia is planning to use up to 2,000 per night. Currently it's 500 per night, and that's already bad enough. And we've also seen, and it's really important to mention, that they aren't simple and cheap anymore. Early on, these were still simpler drones. The Shahed 136 came from Iran and they copied it all. Nowadays, there's so much technology built into them designed to counter the Ukrainians' GPS jamming, ensuring they stay on course even when there's no GPS environment. According to Polish experts, it is estimated that each Geran-2 drone currently carries a price tag of at least €500,000 or even higher. And that would ultimately mean Russia is investing €1 billion every month to carry out relentless attacks on Ukraine. Yes, what is Ukraine doing about it? They are, of course, continuing to try to combat them with all kinds of interception drones. These Geran, but also these smaller Gerberer drones, we remember Gerberer drones, they are, so to speak, the diversionary tactics, if you will. That means in addition to the armed Geran-2 drones carrying 90 kilograms of explosives, these Gerberer drones were also launched simultaneously here. Sent to Ukraine so that the Ukrainians couldn't tell exactly which drone was which, had to fight twice as many, even though those were a bit cheaper. Now we see a smaller Ukrainian interceptor drone wedging itself in, then getting stuck on the engine of the Gabra, unable to fully break free and detach itself. And now you can see how both crash down together. And this is one of the Ukrainian approaches where they don't necessarily use explosives, they don't necessarily use rockets or machine guns or the like, but rather they actually use ramming drones or, well, with small drones equipped with spikes, and they shoot them at these big ones. And you know, when they get tangled up there, there's a good chance the larger one, the Geberer, begins to spin out. Now we can observe it slowly descending from an altitude of 5,000 meters and crashing to the ground, with the small Ukrainian drone flying alongside, continuously streaming live footage of the entire event, which it essentially managed to accomplish, and how it at least ensured here that the Ukrainian military forces, that the air defense no longer needed to track this Gerberer drone, allowing it to fully concentrate on the actual explosives-laden Geran 2 drones instead.